Christopher Walters, and this is 2020.
On the ABC News Magazine, 2020, with Hugh Downs and Barbara Walters. Tonight, an extraordinary event.
I went to war, and that man was definitely my enemy.
In Moscow, American veterans of Vietnam counseling Soviet veterans of Afghanistan.
You teach me, and I'll teach you.
An instant bond.
It's like looking at every mother in the United States who ever lost her son.
A universal message.
And my body speaks. It says, this was war. And my eyes tell you this is peace.
Bob Brown on a new alliance. Their vets and our vets fighting the same war. Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. The deposed president of the Philippines is near death in a Honolulu hospital.
American soldiers and Soviet soldiers have been taught in the past to hate each other and trained to kill each other. But now American veterans of Vietnam and Soviet veterans of Afghanistan are embracing each other. And it gives us a very different story for this Memorial Day weekend. A reminder of the price of war and a vision of what real peace could mean.
The Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan is often referred to as Russia's Vietnam. And now back home, their veterans are facing the kinds of problems our Vietnam veterans faced. In a remarkable testament to changing times, they asked some of our veterans to come to Moscow. Bob Brown went along, saw our soldiers help their soldiers, and saw moments to inspire us all.
On Sunday afternoons in Moscow, women come to visit the graves of Soviet soldiers barely out of their teens who died fighting in Afghanistan. The graves of young sons, and husbands, and fathers. Those who returned alive from Afghanistan often paid another price. Some felt alone with their nightmares and poorly understood in a country that had sent them to fight an unpopular war. The last of the Soviet convoys pulled out of Afghanistan early this year. During more than 9 years of military involvement, soldiers found themselves mired in a conflict where it was difficult to tell their enemies from their allies, where disillusionment led to drug and alcohol abuse. And when they went home, they weren't greeted as heroes. Many felt instead like forgotten men from a conflict in which more than 15,000 had died and 40,000 were wounded. For another group of war veterans, seeing pictures of the despair in the eyes of those returning soldiers was like remembering their own reflections 20 years ago.
I looked in the mirror and saw that look. I was so fed up with people, so frustrated with society. And that's what triggered something in my heart. It chilled me for a moment. I thought, oh my God, here's another generation of Vietnam veterans.
Dan Reed of Mount Pleasant, Iowa, is a Vietnam veteran. He is a member of a group of vets who are about to board a flight to Moscow on a trip that would have been unimaginable a year ago. They are going to the Soviet Union to meet with and try to help those Afghanistan veterans who fought for a different ideology, but who now face many of the problems the Vietnam vets remember, adjusting to disabilities and the stress that follows fighting a war viewed as a mistake in their own country. For another member of this group, 40-year-old Steve Tice of Eugene, Oregon, it is a way to help mark an anniversary. Tice was serving in Vietnam in the spring of 1969 during what was known as the Battle for Hamburger Hill. There, he was hit by a Soviet grenade that shattered the right side of his body and face. His right arm was amputated.
That was 20 years ago in May, and I've known this year was coming up. I was 20 years old when I was wounded, and after this, I'll have been a disabled veteran longer than my body was whole. You know, I have a responsibility to my children, your children, you know, to this world, to speak, and my body speaks. It says, this was war, and my eyes tell you this is peace.
At Sheremetyevo Airport, April 20th, on the other side of the customs area, a gathering of Soviet veterans waited for the group. The greeting started with a burst of recognition.
How are you? Hey, what are you doing?
3 members of the American group, Shad Meshad of Los Angeles among them, had made a previous trip to Moscow 6 months earlier and had already laid a groundwork of friendship. But this was the first time that some others had been on foreign soil since leaving Vietnam.
I couldn't believe, not in my wildest dreams, that I'd ever be standing in the Soviet Union, let alone underneath these circumstances.
Yes, I want you to meet Dan. Nikolai.
Nikolai, how are you?
Dan.
Nice to meet you. Welcome home, brother.
For 10 days, the American vets would visit a country that had supplied the enemy in the war they fought. But their motivations for going ahead, as they began with tours to different sites in Moscow, had a common element, a desire to give some meaning to experiences and injuries which years ago seemed to have none. Many are now involved professionally in veterans counseling and services, and to cover the tour expenses, each paid $2,500 to a Seattle-based peace group called Earth Stewards Network, which organized the visit.
Got it.
On his first walk through Red Square, Danny Reed was still taken aback by the flood of first impressions, including a portrait hung to celebrate Lenin's birthday.
This is one of the most powerful moments in my life. I went to war to defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that man was definitely my enemy. And all the people that believed in what he said were my enemies. And to stand here in this square and look up at that, it's one of the most, it's like he's piercing my very soul. And all the people that I've been in combat with or I may have killed, it seems like, you know, they're walking with me right now. And I just, it's like they've got their hand on my shoulder and they're saying it's all right, you know.
All right. Bill, is this the beginning of world peace or what, huh?
Oh, come on.
All right.
For the next 30 days.
Later that day, the vets from Vietnam and Afghanistan would meet formally for the first time. Here, Bobby Muller, who founded the Vietnam Veterans of America after being partially paralyzed in the war, would give advice to Afghanistan vets on forming their own organization. Danny Reed would try to break the language barrier with Igor Marazov, a 24-year-old, highly decorated veteran. It was a first chance for older men to talk with young men about putting war behind them.
I came back from Vietnam. It's been a year in a hospital.
Я провел год.
Photographs of me when I was a soldier, younger than you.
What a charming child. Child?
Child,
Yeah, Million?
When we came back from Vietnam, there was very little recognition
очень мало.
from everything that I've heard. It's very much the same for the veterans of Afghanistan.
Переупотреблением секса, предположим, с переупотреблением алкоголем.
You teach me, and I'll teach you. You teach me Russian, I'll teach you English.
Yes.
Okay.
Soon enough, the agendas in the days that followed covered the serious issues on which Vietnam vets had years of expertise. Gary May, now a clinical social worker in Evansville, Indiana, on his way to a meeting with Afghanistan veterans and psychologists about the psychological impact of war. Until Afghanistan, Soviet psychologists had little experience treating many of the emotional ills of soldiers who fought an unpopular war. They are seeing a condition to which the Vietnam generation gave a name, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
In Vietnam, we find, with Vietnam veterans, we find that alcohol, drug abuse begins sometimes in the war.
Roger Melton is now a counselor who suffered some of those problems. He emphasized the importance to Vietnam veterans of treatments which have yet to gain much acceptance in the Soviet Union. notably self-help groups in which the veterans were free to talk out their problems. Talking has been part of therapy for Amir Safen. Last May, he was in a tank that exploded when it hit a landmine. And when he regained consciousness after his legs were amputated, he was barely able to write a letter home.
He could not remember letters of Russian alphabet, and he took just an ordinary book trying to recognize what other Russian letters are.
Amir is 20 years old, with an estimated 6 months of hospitalization left. We met him again outside after the session.
People here cannot, and they do not want to understand how difficult it is for those who coming back from Afghanistan. And those who never been there, they try to forget everything about our Afghan warfare.
For that reason, he said, the Soviet bureaucracy has been slow to respond to the needs of veterans. And he added, they have a notorious phrase, "It wasn't I who sent you to Afghanistan." Like Vietnam, the Afghanistan War also generated a body of song. This is Andrei Dmitrichin, whose job is etching faces on tombstones, and who wrote this song after making his first stone for an Afghanistan veteran and discovering the dead man was a childhood friend. The song is called "I Don't Want to Die in a Foreign Land." The only public memorial to the veterans of Afghanistan in the Soviet capital is this stone slab in an isolated corner of a Moscow park. And the Americans were reminded of their own efforts to build the Vietnam Memorial Wall when former Lieutenant Eugene Khrushchev spoke for other veterans' hopes that there will be a larger monument here in the future.
I hope that we'll unite our efforts with Vietnam vets, and I hope we'll do our best possible to prevent repetition of any war whatsoever.
For much of their stay, Gary May and Steve Tice made it a point to visit with disabled veterans in various stages of recovery. At this rehabilitation center, they saw Vladimir Gruz still struggling to recover from war injuries suffered 8 years ago. And in a hospital room, they met 22-year-old Andrei Kirasov, whose legs had been amputated, and Valentin Ryonkin, paralyzed from the waist down when a sniper's bullet hit him in the spine. They were visits that took Gary May back to Vietnam.
April 12, 1968, I was on a point man on a night squad-sized patrol, and I stepped on a landmine, and the explosion resulted in the traumatic amputations of both my legs.
The Afghanistan veterans, each hospitalized for more than 3 years, wanted to know how May and Tice had survived their catastrophic wounds.
The biggest thing, I think, is perseverance, patience. Because of my experience, especially in the early days, it was quite a struggle.
In many ways, we represent healing and what it might look like in 15 years. And then I'm moving around and I'm walking, that Gary's walking. That we were wounded so badly as they were. And that, our bodies are functioning.
Certainly, having been wounded in combat, having suffered the loss of a part of your body, having gone through what we have both gone through in the readjustment to those changes are fairly universal. I mean, it differs little whether that happens to someone who lost a limb in Afghanistan or lost limb or limbs in Vietnam.
Gary May began to develop a close friendship with a man who lost part of his right leg fighting in Afghanistan, Nikolai Chuvanov. Gary can wear his 2 artificial legs only part of the day. The rest of the time, he uses a wheelchair. The chair had been broken on the plane trip to Moscow, but Nikolai took it off to a welder and had it repaired. Hey. And that afternoon, in Gary's room, with the help of a translator, both men felt comfortable enough to compare and examine the limbs that have become a routine element in their lives.
Hooks up there, and then that slides out. That's a hydraulic cylinder in there, And what that does is to control the friction or the force that is needed to bend the knee. You have periods of time, Nikolai, where you did not have your prosthesis and you walked with the crutches, I assume?
He was afraid at that time.
Yeah.
He just couldn't do it.
Yeah. Everybody has limitations. Some of us have limitations that require hardware and wood to fix. Others have limitations that are more hidden, but we all have limitations.
It's better to be without your legs than be a fool.
Yeah, here, here.
That's it.
Yeah, great.
The veterans also saw that, like many small towns in the United States, communities in the Soviet Union had lost disproportionate shares of their young men. This was a memorial service in the small town of Lubertsy, just outside Moscow, which lost 23 men to the war.
My body may have aged and my hair may be getting gray, but the emotions are just the same as they were 20 years ago. When you look into the faces of these parents that lost their young sons in the war, it's like looking at every mother in the United States who ever lost a son.
I think that when you take the pain and the hurt of war and start turning that pain and hurt to more peaceful things, that one feels better off. But it's still a very painful process.
One mother who lost a son told Steve Tice that the visit of the American vet had been an inspiration to her.
The mother says that she, with your soul, she wants to help you.
Спасибо вам, что вам хватает еще энергии.
И she thinks that you have energy of your soul, of your heart for our soldiers, for our veterans of Afghan war.
My oldest son, of course, is in high school. His friends came up to him in school and said that they were very proud of me.
Steve said it was important for him to work with the Soviet families because his family had helped him survive. He had been encouraged to make this trip by his family, especially his children.
They're the people that are now moving into the generation that either remain at home in peace or go to war. And they really appreciate the effort that we're making for peace. It's very important.
Scouts for the American nation and for the friendship between our two countries. Cheers.
The toasts at a farewell dinner were about friendship, sentiments like souvenirs that are reproduced in thousands of times and places. But when these veterans heard them one last time, they would seem fresh again, embellished like keepsakes with real names to remember.
There was an instant bonding, an instant type of trusting relationship formed between all of us. And if we can do it, if people who are in the business of killing other people can become friends, then anybody can do it.
I would like to say to the American people and the Russian people that we share this planet together, and let us do it peacefully and embrace each other rather than wound and kill each other. Let's embrace each other peacefully.
You can't stop looking at this without feeling again the uselessness of war to maim young men. How did you feel going along on this trip? How did it affect you?
Well, you can't help but be moved, especially when it gets down to the one-to-one relationships that are genuinely established so quickly. And one of the Afghanistan veterans said that they found it easier to talk with the Vietnam veterans than it had been to talk with some members of their own family or some of their old friends even.
Because they understood.
Because they understood what they had been through, and they shared a lot of experiences, you know, not exactly the same on the battlefield, obviously, or even politically, but in terms of how it affected them personally.
Well, watching this is very affecting, and I'm sure each of us in our own minds know what the lesson is. Thank you, Bob.